Action methods, after they're done processing, usually return something back to the user, and we refer to these things as action results. And there are a few different kinds of results that an action can return. There are three broad types of responses, and each of these kind of have their own subtypes of responses. But generally speaking, an action result is going to return HTML, usually in a view, although it can return just a string of HTML directly. It'll do a redirect either to another action or to some other view. Or it can return data, and that data can be binary like image files or PDFs. More common data results are things like JSON or XML, but some kind of data that's going to be consumed by some other client. The action result object encapsulates most of these varieties of returnable results, so it's one of the more generic things you can have an action return, and it covers a lot of ground. The most common result you're going to return is an HTML page, which is a view result. This returns a view and possibly with some data bound to it. So the views are going to be your static HTML as well as different Razor code snippets in there that will reveal portions of the model. So it'll bind pieces of data from that model into the view, and ultimately that's the HTML you get back. This is by far and away the most common thing you return from an action, and it's called the view result. To return a view, first we look for it in a folder with the controller's name. Once again, this is an example of that convention over configuration. Rather than mapping out in a file where all the views are, if you just have a folder in the views folder that has the controller's name, that's where the framework is going to look first. If it can't find it there, it's going to look in the shared folder that's in the views folder. But you can also specify paths to the views in the action. So if you decide to store your views differently than the conventions are expecting, that's fine. It's just you're going to have to do a little bit of extra work to tell it exactly where to find the views. You can also pass information to the view besides just what you find in the model. The views and the controller share sort of these bags of data. There's the view data collection. There's the view bag, probably the most common way to do this, although it is more or less syntactical sugar over the view data object. And then, of course, there's the model itself that the controller can populate and pass on to the view. I'm looking at the default home controller that comes up with the default MVC application that Visual Studio produces for you. And you'll notice I've got these different actions, and they return an action result. And remember, this is sort of a base for various kinds of results that you can return. There's JSON results, there's XML results, there's all kinds of different results your action can return. So this is kind of a base for those. And you'll notice each of these actions are returning a view. Now the reason most of these actions don't specify the view name, and in fact get rid of this view name right here even, is because by default the convention is that the framework is going to look for a view with the same name as the action. So for instance, if I pull up the index action fires, it sets the view bag message, and it returns the view. The framework is going to look for a view called index, and it's going to look for that in a folder called home that happens to reside under the views folder. And sure enough, if I come over here to the solution and I look in the views folder, here's the folder called home, here's the index.cshtml, and this is the view that's going to be used by that action. So this is the convention. So as long as you're following these naming conventions, this is about as elaborate as this needs to get. However, if you want to do something like name your views something else, I can actually specify a view name here. And then what the framework will do is it will still look in the same place, the views folder, the home folder, since this is the home controller, but now it'll look for index2.cshtml. And I don't need to put the extension on here, so you can actually give different view names. Now, If for some reason I want to refer to a view that doesn't abide by the conventions at all, I can still do that, although now I have to spell everything out. So now I have to give it more or less a full path. So views, and then, wherever it is that I might go. So this is an option as well. It's just that now I'm kind of fighting conventions, and at least with this application, there's not really a good reason for me to do that. But I just want you to know that option's available to you. You really can access views anywhere you want. So if you like to keep your views in a completely different space, you can absolutely do that. It's just out of the box. They have some very easy and simple conventions to follow that keep you from having to do that. Now, in terms of actually sharing data with the view, you can see that most of these are setting viewBag.message. The viewBag is something that you can just invent properties. So I can say viewBag.whatever I want and set it equal to any kind of object, integers, strings, whatever. Okay? And this is syntactical sugar over the view data collection. What this does is it creates a key called whatever I want and stores this object in here. So the cool thing about this is the viewBag is completely extensible. I can plug whatever I want in there, and I can call it whatever I like. And then in the view, I can pull that value out of the viewBag. So for instance, if I open up the About view, notice that it puts data into the viewBag so the controller can see it, and it uses it here, and it uses it here. The little razor syntax there. So that's what allows us to use the viewBag. Just think of it as a little container for data that you can pass back and forth between your views as you are forming your view result. Another kind of result that we can return from an action is a content result. And we usually use this when we're returning some kind of raw data back to the client, not necessarily HTML or a view. We can return those back as a content result, but typically we use this for data. For example, we can return raw text, whether it's plain text or whether it's in some data format like JSON or XML. I want to use the default home controller here to return some content results, just so you can kind of see how this works. I'm going to come up with my own action here, and I'm going to return a content result. And in this particular case, I'm just going to return plain text back to the client. So it's not necessarily going to be HTML, it's just going to be a string of text. What I do is I wrap this up in content. And what I want to do is provide both the data and the data type just so the client knows what it's getting back in the response. So I could do something like this string is going to appear. And I actually have to tell it the content type. And in this case, it's simply text/plain. Okay, so when I have this here as an action, okay, remember this action is going to be called plain text, so I'm going to need to put that in the URL. Let me build this and fire it up. Home controller, plain text action, and we get a string. Okay, not incredibly remarkable, but it just goes to show that you can send things back to a client besides just HTML, and this string could be pretty much anything, any kind of data that we would want to send back, comma delimited, whatever. Now, we also have certain content results for just about every kind of content type you can imagine. So we can use the same mechanism to return things like images or PDF documents, JSON, although generally we use the JSON result for that. Or you could even return XML. So let's say I wanted to return XML to the client. I can do that here, also with a content result. Call this action getXML. And I'm just going to return a very basic string of XML. Make this the root node. And obviously this could be, as elaborate an XML document as you needed. But I just have to change the content type. So I'm still returning a content result, but I've changed the content type so my client knows that it's going to get XML back this time. I fire this up. Home controller. Get XML for the action. Okay, and now my browser knows that I've got XML back, and it behaves very differently than when I was just returning plain text. There are times when you want your action to return a result that's going to be more or less automatic. It's either part of the framework or it's so closely tied to the .NET framework that you don't need to code a particular action result to cover it. One of these is the implicit action result. This is used when we're returning a primitive type. So if you're returning something that's native to the .NET framework, like a string or an integer or a GUID or something that's a data type that's built into the .NET framework, then you don't necessarily need to create a content result or something just for that. The MVC framework will actually wrap the return result as an appropriate response. If your action just returns a string or an integer or whatever that primitive data type is, the framework will go ahead and handle that for you, and you don't necessarily need to make a content result. Usually what it does is it wraps as a content type for a plain text response. But it can also wrap as other things depending on what the data is that you're sending back. But this is the most common way to do it. So if I return an integer, most likely what the framework is going to do is wrap it as a plain text result and send that back to the client. Another one of these automated sorts of results are the missing resource, the HTTP not found result. And this is mostly used for indicating when a resource is not available. And there are all kinds of uses for this. It might be because the view isn't found or the model doesn't exist, but it can also be for times like if you are trying to look at the details of a particular item, you go to the database to look up that ID and you can't find that item, then returning the HTTP not found result is a perfectly acceptable way to deal with that situation. And it creates an appropriate HTTP status code so that the client knows exactly what happened. It requested a result, and that particular item it was looking for just wasn't found. But it turns out that you can actually return almost any kind of HTTP status code result that you want. So whether you have a deleted record or your ID is out of bounds or any other kind of situation, you can return any HTTP status code that you want so that the client knows what happened. This is very useful for giving clients more detailed information about what happened in your operation. Now, if you've ever worked with services before, you know how frustrating it can be to call a service, for example, and get a result back that's just a 500 internal server error. It doesn't tell you what happened. It just told you that something was wrong. Well, the HTTP status code result allows us to give very detailed information to the client about what happened. We can return error codes, or we can return success codes that are more specific to what actually happened. We can tell them that there was a security violation. Any HTTP status is fair game, including the not implemented HTTP code. So, for example, if someone calls an action that just isn't there or doesn't do anything right now, you can literally return to the client in the response that that functionality has not been implemented. You can also use it to do redirects, which sends an HTTP 301 code to the client so that they know they've been redirected and can do things like adjust their browser history or whatever it is they need to do to compensate for that result. I'm here in a controller that I made called the dog controller, and all it does is it manages this particular model. It keeps a list of dogs, and you can view the list of dogs, you can view details about a particular dog or whatever it is that you need to do. And I want to focus on this particular action where we look at the details. What happens is this action gets an ID passed in, it goes to the dogs list, and it queries for a dog where the dog's ID equals the ID that was passed in. I get the first, or the default, which is going to be null, and then I pass that to the view. Well, the problem is there's no logic in here to handle what happens if we can't find the dog. It'll just get null in here. So in this case, I'm going to return a particular result. I'm going to return the HTTP code result if the dog is null. Now, I do want to say that this might not be the most elegant way to handle this particular situation, because what I might want to do, just to be more user-friendly, is if the dog is null, I might still want to return the details view, but maybe just have a message in there that says, you know, this dog wasn't found, or whatever it is I want to do. I might not want to actually throw this HTTP status back. But depending on what you're doing and how your application is being consumed, returning the code may be exactly what you want to do. So for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to return a new HTTP status code result, and I'm going to return 404. It's an error you might recognize from the internet as the resource not being found, only in this case I'm going to return it not because we can't find a page, but because we can't actually find the dog that we want to work with. So when I fire this up, I'm going to use the dog controller, I'm going to use details, and I'm going to use an ID that I know is not in the list. And now I get a 404 error not found. Okay? And that's how you can use the content results to return HTTP codes to clients.